Hi there. This video is looking at forgetting, right? So this is the companion to memory, right? So learning about the way our memory functions with short-term, long-term, all that good stuff. That's one thing, but what about when it doesn't work the way that it's supposed to, right? So we want to explore some of the different theories about why we forget information, right? So one thing to just kind of start us off with is just because someone does forget something doesn't necessarily mean there's a problem, right? So there's different degrees and levels of it. If it's something like, oh, I can't remember where I put my keys, that's one thing, and usually not generally something that we have to be too concerned about. What's more concerning is if you have a close family member or friend that you regularly interact with and you're forgetting their name, right? That's an indication of a much deeper concern, okay? So some research here. One of the main people that we look at first is a man named Hermann Ebbinghaus, right? He was a German psychologist, and he was interested in how quickly we forget information, right? So what he wanted to do, he's performed a series of studies where he kind of did it on himself due to, at the time, it was right when psychology was becoming a field, so he didn't really have access to a lot of participants yet. So he just did it on himself. Usually not recommended, but the way he did it was pretty smart to work around some of the criticisms that could have come up. So what he did was he would sit down and learn a set of information. I'll talk about that in just a second. He would learn a set of information, and then at a predetermined period of time later, it'd always be a little bit different, he would test himself to see how well he remembered the information, and then he would just plot it on a chart. Okay. So the first thing we're going to look at is the information that he learned, right? So this is what it was. It was things like this. This is what he called nonsense syllables, all right? So they were things that had no significant meaning. There was no attachment that he would have beforehand to help him remember these things. And so this is why we can kind of say, yeah, there was no bias or other issues that we would want to see with that. Now, again, what his goal was to memorize a set of that, and then 20 minutes later, 20 hours later, 20 days later, 2 months later, whatever it is, he would test himself to see how well he remembered that set of information, and again, plot it on a chart. So generally speaking, this is what the chart looks like, right? And so we learned two key pieces of information here. Number one, we forget information very quickly after first learning it, right? So this is, you've learned something new, and you have not thought about it, you have not rehearsed that information, you have not retrieved it, you haven't studied it, you've done nothing with it. What we're going to see is that within about 20 minutes of learning that information, you have forgotten approximately 40%. Okay, 40%. So if you're in a class, you're paying attention to the teacher and what they're saying, you walk out of that class, within 20 minutes, you've forgotten 40% of everything they talked about. Okay, we fast forward to a day. Right? You left that class. It's been a day. You haven't done any studying, any reviewing. You haven't thought about that class at all. What we're going to see is that at that point, just one day later, you've already lost 65% of everything that you learned. That's how, on average, how much we forget. Right? So we forget information, a lot of information, very quickly. Okay? What we also see, though, as you can kind of see here on the chart, if you go past the 24 days, so 24 days and 2 days, a little bit of a dip. Not that much, though. 2 days to 6 days, almost no difference whatsoever. And then from 6 days to a month, 31 days. Slight drop, but not that much, right? So that's the second thing that we learn from Ebbinghaus, that we forget information very quickly, but at a certain point, it starts to stabilize, right? We won't see as many issues with it moving forward. Okay? So why do we forget things then? One idea is what we call the encoding failure, right? So because you didn't properly encode the information to begin with, we can't pull that information from a long-term memory, right? And so the reason we didn't encode it properly was, say maybe we weren't really paying attention, right? So our attention was, we were distracted, or was divided in some kind of way, or, we're just being kind of absent-minded. The way I like to think about this is you go to a restaurant, server comes over, they tell you their name, give you the menus and everything. Server walks away. You start thinking about what you're going to get to drink, if you want any appetizers, anything like that. And I can guarantee you the vast majority of us have already forgotten that server's name. It's just gone because we weren't really paying attention to begin with, and then we were distracted. Okay, so that's one idea, the encoding failure. Okay, another theory is what we call the decay theory, and this is best summed up as use it or lose it. Okay, so if we go back to the brain and how neuroplasticity works, right? So things, neural pathways that are continually used are strengthened. The ones that are not wither away, right? And are not strengthened. So if there's a particular set of memories that you are not accessing, the pathway to those memories will weaken over time because they're not being maintained as much, right? So it's a use it or lose it type of a situation. Okay, so we need to like refresh those memories by thinking about them and trying to retrieve that information from long-term memory. All right, we also have motivated forgetting. So sometimes we want to forget something, right? So something traumatic or even just embarrassing happened, right? Anything that's unpleasant or painful to think about, in a certain sense, we're almost like motivated to forget those things, to not have those memories anymore. So that's something that's possible. Okay. Other times, forgetting might be associated with imperfect or false memories. Right. So this research comes from Elizabeth Loftus and some of the things that she did, which were pretty interesting. The main takeaway, that if I had to summarize what she came up with, though, was the confidence in a memory has no bearing whatsoever on how accurate or true it actually is. Right. So another way to say that is that you're remembering something and you say to yourself, I know with 110% certainty that this is what happened and how it happened. What we know from her research is that means nothing. It means nothing. All right. We misremember things all the time. And there's a number of different reasons why that may occur. But when we look at imperfect memories, false memories, where they kind of get confused maybe with other ones, our memory is not infallible. In fact, we make errors all the time. And so just because you're very certain that something happens doesn't mean it actually did. Okay. Lastly, what we can look at is amnesia. Right? So there's different types of amnesia. What we want to focus on are the ones caused by some kind of physical, usually damage to the brain. Right? It could be a car accident or other kind of physical trauma. It could be a disease. It could be a tumor. It could be stroke. Any number of different reasons that's causing some kind of damage or injury to the brain. Okay? So amnesia is what we call severe memory loss. Right? So generally speaking, if we want to look at memory as information saved on a hard drive, our brain's a hard drive, our memories are stored, this is us hitting delete. So those memories do not exist anymore. Okay. Now, there's two types of memories, or two types of amnesia, sorry. There's what we call retrograde amnesia. This is the one that you're probably more familiar with. All right. So this is where memories of things that have happened in the past are no longer accessible. Right. And almost always those memories are focused on us. It's focused on episodic memory. Right? So someone has a car accident, let's say, they wake up in the hospital and they cannot remember either a period of time of, let's say, a couple hours, a couple days, a couple years, or maybe their entire life. They have no idea who they are anymore. But they could still do math. They could still tell you certain facts, like who was the first president of the United States. They could probably still tell you stuff like that. They just don't know anything about them or the events of their life. Okay, so that's retrograde amnesia. We also have anterograde amnesia. Okay, so with anterograde amnesia, what's happening here is that for the most part, any previous memories tend to be intact. There might be a couple issues here and there, but the main feature, what we're seeing here, is that these are individuals who cannot form any new memories. Right? So as they take information in, they can hold things in their short-term memory. We have that. But then we cannot encode any new memories into long-term memory. Right? That encoding process doesn't take place anymore. Nothing seems to stick. Right? So this is, you're having a conversation with somebody new, you're meeting them, everything's great. You turn to look away, do something over here, you turn back to look at that person, and you have no memory of who they are or anything that was just talked about. Right? Anything outside of that short-term memory is just no longer possible. Okay.
So these are some of the things that might impact our memory and our ability to remember, and hopefully help us to have a better understanding of why we forget things.